final speech today is from a distinguished keynote speaker. She is an international best-selling author and a global lecturer in economics, money laundering, and terrorism. So she was also a consultant for the World Bank and the governments, and her latest book, which is this one, Technocapitalism, explores how big tech leaders have hijacked innovation for profit. And today, I think we will also learn about it. So without further ado, please welcome the investigative reporter and economist, Loretta Napoleoni, to the stage. Loretta, the stage is yours.
Thank you. See, I use paper, so there's no space for paper. Right, so I've been given a very difficult task to end this really interesting conference, not only because everybody's tired and many of you have to catch a plane, but also because I'm going to talk about the future of the tech industry in Europe. And of course, one of the first impediment is resources. We have very little resources. Now, I can't multiply the loaves and the fishes, neither can you, but perhaps together we can think about a strategy, something out of the box, which is something that perhaps we're very good at being Europeans. So I will talk about the elephant in the room, which is the US. So I'm going to start. Well, somebody had to do that. So I'm going to start with a story. So the technological revolution started in the 1980s in the United States. But there is a story that perhaps not everybody knows, is that in the early 80s, right at the beginning of this revolution, a group of nerds, right? So they were computer programmed, they were mathematicians. They got together in the Bay Area. They all worked in the Silicon Valley industry, which at the time was, very small. And the reason why they met is because they were concerned about the interference of the state in the net. They thought the state was going to spy individuals that were using the net to interact with each other, and they wanted to prevent that. So they decided to form a study group, and the study group was going to work to create an encrypted system through which the individuals could talk to each other on the net without having the state spying on them. These people were called the cyberpunk. So why did they do that? Well, I think we have to understand where they were coming from. These were individuals that grew up during the Cold War. They went through the trauma of the Vietnam War, the Korean War. Even before that, they witnessed, of course, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So their relationship with the state was of mistrust. They didn't want the state to be involved in the net because they believed that the net had a great internal force, which was a force that was working towards democracy. So because of that, they decided to protect the individual. So their commitment was to the freedom, the digital freedom of people who were going to be the users of the net. So what is interesting is that there was a limitation to their desire to guarantee freedom, and this limitation was the fact that any kind of transaction taking place inside the net had to go through the traditional financial channels, which is either bank transfers or credit card. And through that, of course, the state could monitor. I mean, basically, the state could see what was happening between two or more than two individuals. So it was only with the advent of Bitcoin and blockchain that this impediment was removed. Now we're talking about 2008. So this is the story of the cyberpunks. Now, the cyberpunk, of course, predicted a lot of development within the net, but they also fail to predict some of the negative impacts. So the first, for example, is the birth of the dark net. So the dark net was made possible because of the encryption, and then later on, because of the possibility to do exchanges financially away from traditional financial channels. They also did not predict the formation of oligopolies. They did not predict the harvesting of personal data, the conditioning of social media, and also the advent of artificial intelligence and the impact this one was going to have on the labor market. So all of these elements were smashing the concept that the net is a synonymous of democracy. On the contrary, actually, they show how the net could present a serious danger if it's not regulated. And the only way to regulate it is actually through the state, not through a group of individuals, even if they want to do good. So the cyberpunk also did not predict the digitalization of our life, which today is actually changing the way we live, the way we interact, but also is posing, as we have seen in the last two panels, is posing a threat to the maintenance of democracy in our world. So today I thought to focus only on one of the many possible threats, and this is actually the interaction between economics, technology, and national security. So the technological revolution not only started in the US, it was fostered in 2008 after the great bailout by money coming from Wall Street. So the bulk of this money actually went straight to Silicon Valley to fund a infant industry. And some of these companies that today are the largest companies in the world were right there ready to absorb these funds. And these companies are, as you know, Google, of course now it's called Alphabet, Facebook, Amazon. Now the reason why this happened is because that sector was the sector that provided the most profitable return to an industry, which is finance industry, which was not really, very much impacted by the big crash. On the contrary, they actually got sufficient money to move from one big industry, which was, the subprime, to another one, which was high-tech. Now, this was a blessing not only for the technological industry, for Silicon Valley in particular, but also was a blessing for the US economy. If you look at the charts of the stock market index, those companies at the beginning were 5, today they're 7, the magnificent 7. Those companies sustain all the growth of the stock market at the time in which there was a massive downturn. So this is when the United States, and when I talk about the United States, I'm talking about, the elite, the establishment, the government, the political parties, they realize that maintaining a hedge over other countries in the technological industry was a condition to maintain the hegemonic position of the United States. So, in other words, the US had to continue to be the leading country in this sector, not only for monetary reason, for financial reason, but primarily for national security reason. That was the only way to maintain its position in the balance of powers of the world. Now, the first policy that we heard about maintaining this was that in 2016 when Trump was elected, and the Trump administration actually went aggressively in putting in place policy to protect, to strengthen, and foster the technological advantage of the United States. So you remember the microprocessor war? So war. So the microprocessor war was aimed at preventing the export of technology from the United States to China, which is, by the way, the biggest competitor to the U.S. And also, the same kind of strategy was imposed upon European companies. European companies were told, and here I must say the EU went along with it, were told that they could not trade with China when it came down to certain kind of technology. So all of this was done to protect an industry, the U.S. industry, which was strategically vital for the U.S. But also this was a prelude, so don't think that this is only Donald Trump, because it's not like that at all. So this was a prelude of the policy pursued by Joe Biden in order to bring back production of microprocessors and anything that is of need for this strategic industry into the United States. Now, all of this is called economic nationalism. So economic nationalism ended globalization. And it opened a new chapter in geopolitics, and we're leaving this new chapter. Technology has become a key instrument of national security. This is not only in terms of application on new weapons. I mean, we have no time to discuss about intelligent weapons, but that field is very vast. But also in terms of maintenance of the status quo. And in this status quo, the United States is the hegemonic power. Now, what's happened to Europe during these years? Well, I would say that Europe has played second fiddles to the United States. Okay, initially, our disadvantage was that Europe was split in two during the Cold War, of course. But, after 1990s, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, in reality, we could have done more than we have done. Why didn't we do that? Because we did not understand the strategic importance of the tech industry, as simple as that. And then also because we, as usual, unfortunately, I have to say, we lean on the US in terms of technology and development. This is our very nice ally, so why doing anything in a field where, this ally is doing very well? Oh, well, that was, a very big mistake. Now, we realized that, of course, at a certain point. And when we realized that, what do? We actually introduced a series of legislation which are very good in order to minimize the negative impact that the formation of oligopolistic high-tech companies in the US was having upon the individual, avoid discrimination, regulate data mining, for example, but also, in order to give the user the possibility to control its own data. Now, all of these legislation are very good. We heard today some of them, but had no impact because, the geographical core of this industry at global level is not here. It's in another continent. It's in a continent where there is a completely different legislation, and this legislation is very lax in comparison to our legislation. more to the point, the second largest core of this industry is in another continent because it's in China, where, of course, there is a completely different legislation. So here we are, we have done great things, but we're still lagging behind, massively behind the US and China. And we have lost competitiveness during this period of time because, we did not analyze the problem in the right way. So just to read you one sentence of the famous Draghi report, which is now the new Bible, right, of Europe. Here what he says. The General Data Protection Regulation is estimated to have reduced the profits for small tech companies in Europe by more than 15%. Now, I personally think that this is a conservative estimate. I think it's more. But anyway, so where do we stand now? What we're seeing at the moment is that the emphasis is shifted, or has already shifted from a 10 billion compute clusters to 100 billion compute cluster to $1 trillion computer cluster. Now we're talking about a phenomenal amount of money. It almost looks like that every 6 months another zero is added to this figure. And of course, inside the boardrooms of the US high-tech companies, they're discussing this and they're counting the profits they're going to make very, very soon. So if you look at the US, all the American big business is actually gearing up to become part of this industry. And they're happy to invest. I mean, there is plenty of money. While here, we're struggling because, there are very little funds, and we have to beg, the EU to give us some funds. In the US, they're showering people with money. I mean, we got to face this. At the same time, the national security industry is enjoying a renaissance that they haven't seen since the end of World War II. I mean, there's massive investment into intelligent weapons. I mean, it's too bad that we can't go into that. Surveillance, you name it. I mean, the US is renewing completely its weapon arsenal using the new technology in order to produce more efficient and more deadly weapons. So imagine we're talking about an extraordinary amount of money, resources, state support, because don't forget about the fiscal advantages that these people have, innovation and development. Now all of this, of course, he exercised a tremendous pull on any talent. I mean, no wonder European talent, go to the state. We heard actually today about the Afghan women that were, snatched, I would say, by the US because, they understood the advantage of having that kind of talent. And the same is for us. It's the same as for Europeans and non-Europeans who actually have been forged in our universities. So we are a sort of recruitment agency for the US tech industry. Wow, isn't it great? We don't even get a cut out of it. So what do we do? Sorry, I get very excited about these things. So, well, I tell you that competing on the same ground, it's impossible. There's no way we can do that. So we got to think outside the box. And I think that ethics is the field where we actually have an advantage. We always had an advantage. We have done the right thing. And people know, users know, but even companies know. I mean, there are a lot of companies that want to operate in an ethical environment, that they don't want to compete as in the far west. There is a core, I think, of business that will, if it's presented with an alternative, actually choose Europe instead of the United States. And what is the commitment? It's not only making money, because of course, making money is important, but it's also to do the right thing, so the common good. Now, technology, as the cyberpunks thought, should empower people, should not enslave people. But what we've seen is actually exactly the opposite that has happened. So, how do I think we can catch up? Okay, so these are the three areas: money, energy, and national security. So we could print the money. I have no time to get into that, but I'll be happy to have a discussion with any of you. I'm an economist. We printed money for the sovereignty debt crisis. Draghi did, by the way. Didn't he say, we'll do whatever he needs to save the euro? Well, why can't we do whatever it needs to save our industry? We did it. We can do it again. We printed money during COVID, so we can do it. We also can do it with the projected revenues, profits, using those profits to sterilize those money, something that we haven't done, in 2008, in 2011, or, with COVID. So how this money can be used? I think this money can be used, number one, research and development, new projects, policy to incentivize scientists not to migrate to the United States but stay in Europe, and empower people. Promote a new mechanism to make the industry function more efficiently. So we need a good competition policy. Our competition policy is discriminating against some companies, European companies. Now, we cannot do that. We need to protect our industry. Now, not the way that the US is doing. I'm not talking about economic protectionism or economic nationalism, but we do need to protect the industry. European alliance, again, somebody before said, we speak all different languages. Everybody speaks English. Who cares if, the US, the UK is not anymore in the EU? English could be the lingua franca, providing that we want to do it. So if we are in Holland, then let's make sure that everybody speaks English and not Dutch, so that the Spaniards or the French, they are in the lab. But it's out of politeness anyway, that are not cut out. And then let me come to the major obstacle. I'm going to skip national security because that's too complex to go into NATO and all these things. But the real obstacle, even if we do all of this, is energy. The United States is a net exporter of energy. We are not a net exporter of energy. Not at all. So I have some figures here, and I don't know if the projections are right or wrong, but if it's not 5 years, it may be 7 years, but we're talking about, let's say, within the next 10 years, we will need an increase in the US to sustain the growth of the industry. We will need an increase of about 20% of production, of today's production of the US to be added. Now, the US has no problem at all to do that because, of course, it's a net exporter and it's, the big producer of natural gas. Why do you think that during the debate between Trump and Kamala Harris, there was quite a lot dedicated to fracking? Kamala Harris used to be, green. She was anti-fracking. Now she's in favor of fracking. Well, I tell you what, that the Marcellus Utica Shale, which is in Pennsylvania, okay, alone, only that, can produce 36 billion cubic feet a day of gas, which is about 150 gigawatt. So it could power easily one of these, super computer. The $1 trillion 100 gigawatt cluster alone can be done only with that single shale field. And okay, so China is positioning itself also very well in terms of energy. In the last decade, it has increased its production of energy of the amount equivalent to the entire production of the United States. They are building a solar plant in the low Earth orbit, so it is likely that China may actually overtake the US. I mean, in the energy race, China may actually win. So we cannot compete. Now, my personal opinion now, I think this is a political decision. We got to talk about our neighbors who are large producers of natural gas. And I'll leave it to that, because I don't want to get into that. But assuming all of this, we have energy, we have legislation, where do we go? I think we have to create niche markets. So niche markets where we can leverage what we have, which is, of course, our ethics. Now, talking about, for example, the difference between cluster computer. I'm not an expert, so I'm an economist, but I did study these things to understand, but I may be wrong. But the US, it seems to me, is really focusing on cluster computing. Well, we are more leaning towards, cloud computing. So why don't we really invest heavily on cloud? Now, cloud is going to be cheaper than cluster, so we don't have, the same money that the US. But also, cloud is more feasible for a decentralization approach to data, something that the US is not interested at all. And then again, we go back to the concept of digital democracy. Why don't we, Europe, start promoting this concept? You never hear about that. So perhaps projecting a completely different image. So bringing the fight, because it is a fight, it's a race, but it's also a fight, into the ethical field. Then maybe we have a chance. I'm not saying that we're going to succeed, but then maybe we have a chance. And again, I repeat what I said before. The consumer will be happier. The producer, some of them, will be happier. There will be a fair competition. And the common good is going to be achieved. So imagine in 10 years' time, we have two realities, one in the US, which we described, one in Europe, where the European actually protects the industry. And you are a young entrepreneur, maybe you're coming from Scandinavian countries, you may decide to stay here, because this is where things are done properly. So that is my feeling. So to conclude, don't want to keep it too long. So the cyberpunks were wrong because they thought the state was the enemy. Now, some of them were libertarians. But at the end of the day, they were right about the protection of the individual inside the net. This is a responsibility that, of course, cannot be taken by single individual, but by the state. So, the state is the one that can regulate and guarantee, the freedom inside the net. What I want to add before ending is there is an area where actually we could perhaps try to get before anybody else, or where we can compete with the US, and this is the low Earth orbit. There's a lot of activity going on up there, and the low Earth orbit is a place where actually cloud computing could, data storage also could take place. Now in the US, the private sector together with NASA and other state sectors are heavily investing in that. The Chinese also are heavily investing in the low Earth orbits. We are tiptoeing in that area. But I think that is a possibility where to test this new model that we should develop. And I'm very sorry I'm not a politician, because there's nothing else I can do. But thank you. Sure.
Someone has some comments. Sorry, I'm going to speak to the mic. Some comments, questions? No, but quite interesting. Yeah, okay.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, on last, well, thank you very much for your thoughts on this. I want to follow up on you mentioned on the opportunity in the low Earth orbit, because I don't know if today at some point we've been talking about this concept of a space edge, so this idea of also using satellites involved not only in communication but also in data processing. But I would like you to also elaborate a bit on how some of the people and some of the companies, some of the big tech companies in the US are developing these new initiatives in the low Earth orbit, because I think it's there are actually specific people very, very much into this trend, right?
Yeah. So, well, they're the usual suspects, of course. So you know that there is the creation of this satellites nebula by Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and this is, of course, to provide internet everywhere, continuous internet, but also to harvest data. And it's working very well. I mean, I actually was in the desert in the US, and at a certain point, I could link up to Starlink. So, I mean, it's very, very efficient. But there are also lots of companies that are working in space to do research. I mean, for example, for medical devices. And again, the US has the funds and has the money. And then going up and down is fairly easy, because we have mini satellite, the miniaturization of satellites. So, well, before we had huge satellites. Now we're having smaller and smaller, so it's getting easier to go up. It's also getting easier to function up there, without talking about the industry of tourist industry in space, which of course it's not going to be a big element. One area where there is very little activity and where the couple of European companies are actually active is the cleaning up of debris, because there are massive amount of debris. Now, this is a quite dangerous phenomenon, because nobody clears up. So there are lots of satellites were obsolete. They're left up there. Some of them come back into the atmosphere, but they're not destroyed completely, so they break up. Now, even a very small debris in space can be extremely lethal because of the speed. I mean, everything goes so fast. So they pose also a danger to astronauts that work in space. So there are a couple of companies that are actually experimenting. They're not yet fully active, experimenting on clearing up. Now that's, I think, is an area that potentially can be, very profitable, and where we could compete. So, imagine some grants for companies that want to do that, or or want to research that kind of technology.
So history, not only the recent history, but the history of the European tech industry is plenty of opportunity that we missed. Also due to the lack of, say, the right political environment, maybe the lack of vision of the politicians of the past. In your opinion, the present politicians in Europe are exactly what we need not to repeat the same kind of mistakes, or at least to recognize the problem and the opportunities? And if not, do you think that in the near future, not the future, the far future, we may have this kind of politicians? So what do we need? You said you're not a politician, but at least you can figure out what should be the characteristic of these politicians to really guide Europe in these challenges.
Well, I think that the professional that work in different branches of the EU, especially, for example, people that work in the legislation, they're very, very good. I was very impressed. When I was writing this book, I interviewed several of them. But then if we go to the politicians, I would say no, actually. It's not a priority, It's just not. See, this is what I do not understand, is that, we're all living in the same world. They see what is happening on the other side of the Atlantic. So why... why nobody brings it up as a priority? This is the tech industry. It is the industry of the future. As simple as that. To a certain extent, I think the European politicians are too focused on service. Traditional, service sector, because that makes it easier for them to be re-elected. In terms of dependency from the U.S., I think because we're under the military umbrella of NATO, whereby the U.S. is the largest contributor, there is a sort of dependency towards the U.S. So a willingness not to upset the U.S. I don't believe that it is right that Donald Trump told a Dutch company that it could not trade with China anymore. It's none of his business, you know what I mean? But it has happened and will continue to happen. And it happens also with this administration. They know they can do it. So today, for example, somebody sent me an email. There was an open letter written by several people in the tech industry, among which, of course, Zuckerberg. There were several Europeans that also signed it. In this letter, they say that Europe has to stop not having a proper policy towards AI because Europe will lose the advantage of AI, the growth that AI will produce. The European people will suffer. And I just read that thing. Oh, by the way, they were all men that signed it, no women talking about it. But I read it and I thought, what does it mean? I mean, there is a legislation in place. There are several legislation in place, and the legislation are in place to be changed as things change. Otherwise, we will still be, in the caves, right? So what does it mean? Europe does not have a proper legislation for AI, what the US does? Is it the tone, the attitude is, we are the boss, and you have to comply. So until our politicians realize that this is not the way forward, I'm afraid that there's very little we can do.
Thank you very much, Loretta. One huge applause for a brilliant speech.